Let me begin by introducing myself. I am Manoj Mitta. On behalf of the Foundation for Media Professionals, I welcome all of you to what is our 14th media dialogue in the last couple of years. We've been organizing such panel discussions in pursuit of our object of promoting free speech and quality journalism. Given our admitted bias in favor of free speech, it was but natural for us to take up the subject of Azadi. This deceptively simple term, which is at the heart of the Kashmir dispute, means different things to different people, depending on their political orientation. The abortive attempt to slap Arundhati with a sedition case and the demand to rein in Kashmir interlocutors bear testimony to the sheer diversity of nuances associated with Azadi. What we are going to discuss now is not Kashmir's Azadi, but the media's Azadi on Kashmir. The challenges posed by Kashmir to media professionals are in some ways unique. Given the inherent danger of secession, no other region or test or issue tests journalists as much on their ability to transcend nationalist or strategic rhetoric. It is difficult for them to be objective about aspirations for Azadi, whether within India or from India. For instance, striking a blow for free speech 5 decades ago, the Supreme Court had ruled that spreading disaffection or hatred against the government does not constitute sedition. This archaic provision of sedition, it was clarified, cannot be invoked against anybody unless they had incited violence or called for an armed rebellion. Yet, a TV channel thought it fit to campaign for a sedition case against Arundhati Roy and Gilani without producing a shred of evidence on how either speaker had called for violence in the recent meeting in Delhi. Such irresponsible conduct, if anything, calls for introspection on whether the media is part of the problem or the solution. Whether the media can contribute to the peace process if it allows its commitment to free speech to be clouded by jingoism. On the other hand, it must be admitted that the militancy plaguing the state over the last 2 decades has left little scope for non-Kashmiri Muslim journalists to be based in Srinagar and report from ground zero. This is also an encroachment on free speech. I am also happy to welcome Ashok Malik as he represents a fresh voice from the right. In our earlier debates, we had either Chandan Mitra or Swapan Das Gupta filling this slot. Whether it is Kashmir or other political issues, Ashok has a record of raising serious concerns which liberals might have overlooked. Najib Mubaraki, who is going to be joining us shortly, is a rare Kashmiri Muslim journalist working for a national daily from Delhi. He writes on the edit page of the Economic Times. He is also one of the speakers at the recent meetings in Delhi and Srinagar addressed by Arundhati and Gilani. Javed Naqvi, who is here, will provide us the perspective of a Muslim journalist from the Indian mainland. Since he writes extensively for the Pakistani media, he is also in a position to give us a comparative analysis of the media treatment of Kashmir in India and Pakistan. Graham Smith, a Canadian journalist based in Delhi, was specially chosen to talk about how the media in his country covers an avowedly secessionist party which wins elections from the Quebec province. Of course, the degree of Azadi is greater in Canada because they don't have to contend with a hostile neighbor sending armed militants to foment trouble.
You forget the Americans.
Do they? I didn't know that they have a record of sending militants across the border. But I take your point. Siddharth Varadarajan, who will be joining us shortly, is the National Bureau Chief of the Hindu, and he is one of the most distinguished members of the Foundation for Media Professionals. Given his rich experience in dealing with public policy matters at the national and global level, Siddharth is eminently suited to moderate this panel discussion. Unfortunately, I will, however, have to play his role at the beginning. And as I said, as soon as he comes, I will be vacating the chair. So, thank you very much. So, we'll start the panel discussion now. I just finished with the introductory address, so now you can take it.
You want to say a few things?
Professor, really used.
अच्छा साहब, चेयर की इजाजत से अव्वल तो मैं कुछ हिंदी में बोलूंगा जिसको आप लोग उर्दू समझते हैं। अव्वल तो ये जो मुसलमान वाला तमगा लगा दिया गया है उससे मैं थोड़ा सा परेशान हूं, इसलिए कि जो मेरा तजुर्बा है कश्मीर का, उसमें बड़ी दिलचस्प चीजें हुई। I covered the strife there in the 1990s, right? In fact, right from 90 onwards, and there was an organization there at that time which emerged with an agenda to fix those among the journalists who are prone to having a drink in the evenings after we laid our story to rest. मुझे याद नहीं है नाम उसका क्या है, हरकतुल मुजाहिदीन थे मेरे ख्याल से। तो हमारे एक दोस्त थे वहां, और अब कहने को तो मुसलमान थे, लेकिन शाम को उन्हीं के घर पे महफिलें होती थी। और जो उस वक्त आडूस होटल था, जैसे कि आपने देखा होगा कि wherever there is a crisis, whether in Baghdad or Beirut, the international community or there's a native instinct always allows you to save one hotel for journalists. And it was Adus in the case of Srinagar, because the militants had warned others to close down or wind up, and in any case the security forces had taken over some of the hotels for their own pleasures and safety. So वहां पे आडूस में एक मैनेजर के डेस्क के पीछे एक बोर्ड था और बहुत मजेदार था, और वो भी टेक्स केयर ऑफ ऑल दिस थिंग अबाउट Muslim, because it was owned by obviously some orthodox Muslims. I don't know their names. और पीछे लिखा था you drink here at your own risk. ये नहीं लिखा था you are not allowed to drink here. ये लिखा था you drink here at your own risk. Ardu's hotel was meant for those journalists, Muslims or otherwise, who considered themselves to be independent of the government of India and its security apparatus. So they were not Hindu, Muslim or Christian journalists in Kashmir. They were nationalist or pro-government journalists and those who considered themselves independent of the caring concerns of New Delhi. So, whereas the Sarkari journalists, if I may call them that, and they are still there in abundance, they used to occupy what is now the Chhaoni area. Srinagar always had its own green zone. And the rest of us were in Adus. I used to represent an international news agency called Reuters, and BBC and others, mostly Indian journalists. They used to stay at Adus. One of the reasons was, of course, that it was a kind of a no man's land where a militant like Mast Gul, for example, could walk in to give an interview, and just as he was leaving, a BSF commandant was carrying 2 bottles of rum wrapped in newspapers for the same journalist who had just finished with Mast Gul, and the two would probably meet in the corridor, and there was a certain degree of ethics, certain propriety about it, that they didn't bother each other. तो इस तरह की गलत फहमियाँ जो हैं उसके हम मेरे ख्याल से बहुत अच्छी खासी हद तक शिकार हैं, और मैं समझता हूँ कि इस डिवीजन के परे देखना चाहिए। जैसे मैंने कहा कि मेरे कहीं जो सरकारी सहाफ़ी है और जो गैर सरकारी सहाफ़ी है वो एक रियल माने रखता है, और वो कश्मीरी जो मुसलमान हैं जिनके नाम पे आज बात हो रही है उनमें भी आप पाएंगे। और किसने किसको गोली मारी या किसने किसको बम से उड़ाया जर्नलिस्टों में बड़ी ट्रेजेडी है वहां की, वो भी आप पाएंगे कि अच्छा ये सस्पेक्टेड था, ये मिलिटेंट्स के साथ था, लिहाजा सिक्योरिटी फोर्सेस ने उसको मार दिया, या ये इनके साथ था तो उसको मिलिटेंट्स ने उड़ा दिया। लेकिन कोई भी वजह हो, हिंदू हो, मुसलमान हो, मेनलैंड इंडिया जिसे आपने कहा वहां से हो, या उस कश्मीरी जजीरे से हो, वो सरकारी और गैर सरकारी में अगर हम इसको रखें तो मेरे ख्याल से ज्यादा मुनासिब होगा। ये वो पीरियड था जब रिप्रेशन था जर्नलिस्ट के ऊपर। इंडियन I think Tavleen Singh used to be there visiting at that time, and she was, in my opinion, a well-respected journalist at that time, and she spoke up, as did I, on behalf of the Kashmiri journalists who were isolated, who were marginalized, who were always badgered, suspected by the police chief, the army spokesman, everywhere you go, and they were treated and mistreated, suspected, the credentials, Kashmiris. और जो आज हो रहा है आम आदमी के साथ, उस वक्त हम उनके लिए लड़े, और कुछ हद तक मैं ये क्लेम कर सकता हूं कि उस जमाने में उनको एक्सेस मिलने लगी वहां पे, वरना वो वाकई बेचारे बहुत खस्ता हाल में थे। लेकिन जैसा कि हम जानते हैं मेनलैंड में जो होता है वो वहां भी होता है। मेनलैंड में आपको मिलेंगे मुख्तलिफ नजरियों के जर्नलिस्ट्स, आइडियोलॉजिकली ड्रिवन, जैसे अभी आपने कहा कि वो फार राइट के हैं या राइट विंग के हैं, तो राइट विंग लेफ्ट विंग होते हैं जर्नलिस्ट, और क्यों ना हो, आसमान से तो उतरे नहीं है। तो अब अगर कोई किस्मत का मारा बाहर से आया और उसने कहा आई नीड अ फिक्सर, फिक्सर होता है उसमें वो जो टेलीविजन वालों के लिए अरेंज करता है इंटरव्यूज और पैराफर्नेलिया। अब उसके हाथ अगर बाएं बाजू का फिक्सर लग गया तो उसको सब बाएं बाएं नजर आएगा, और अगर उसको दाएं बाजू का फिक्सर लग गया, और कुछ लोग ब्रीफ होके आते हैं, तो ये आप इस तरह के शेरपाज को वहां कश्मीर में भी पाएंगे. You will find these variables in the valley, in Kashmir, among journalists. They will come to you with their respective perspectives, and obviously those perspectives which are helpful to the government will be more encouraged by the state, and those that defy, for example, there is a great mythology in my view that is being orchestrated, that everything has become normal now, as it were, in Kashmir after this period of stone pelting, and now we don't get that in the headlines. Things have moved to AICC, and whether they've discussed corruption or they've discussed RSS. But the Kashmir stories fallen off the main page. सेल्यूशन आ गया कहीं बीच में, लेकिन उसके बाद फिर करप्शन. तो वहां पे जो हालात हैं वो चल रहे हैं बिल्कुल मामूल की तरह. टॉर्चर हो रहा है, एलियनेशन उसी तरह से है, गुस्सा उसी तरह से है, और दास्तान बिल्कुल वैसे ही चल रही जैसे हमने 1990s में देखा था. हाँ, ये बात अलग है कि रोल बदले. After the end of the Cold War, when the West was supporting the so-called insurgency in Kashmir, till the American embassies and the British High Commissions, they all shut their shops, and they started turning away the guys who were so used to the comfort level at American embassies, and you know how we forget. We have a very short memory. The British High Commission was there 24 hours in the valley. Then something happened with Al Farhan kidnapping. Very mysterious thing happened, kidnapping the Western hostages and killing one of them. And very mysteriously, some American journalists, sort of escaped. And that, very interesting, was a turning point where suddenly Islam became, although Islam was, as was the case in Afghanistan, Islam was also spearheading the movement then, but Islam was very comfortable a thought and as an ideology for the West at that time. We, of course, in Delhi the government felt that it was not right. देखिए, इन्होंने उर्दू में लिखा है, ये हमारे वरदराजन साहब ने, 3 मिनट बाकी हैं. तो कौन कहता है कि उर्दू जो है मुसलमानों की जुबान है? मैं यही कहूंगा कि आजादी जर्नलिस्ट के लिए होना ना होना, मेरे ख्याल से जो सवाल रेलेवेंट हैं इन द केस ऑफ कश्मीर, ये इक्वली रेलेवेंट and important when it comes to discussing a running story, a major story. What are the access that we have in Chhattisgarh, for example? Is there a story happening there on a daily basis there or not? In Jharkhand? How many pairs of eyes or ears do we have there as among journalists? And how many publications are prepared to give space to those stories? I'm not saying you take the Maoist angle, but for God's sake, come up with something. Is there repression going on there? Is there a calamity happening there? Are people, or is there just something normal that is happening? Or have we forgotten about it? Or is there a wave, it moves like a Mexican wave in a football field where, okay, now this is the story and it moves on for a while and then we move on to the next story, like the corruption thing is now hogging the... So, I think the access, what happened in Ayodhya? I mean, where were the journalists? I haven't seen a footage, I believe it is there with the Intelligence Bureau, of the mosque's actual demolition, because the journalists had been driven away. Not by the state, but by state-backed agencies. which is the right-wing politics, I believe is state-backed. I don't think any right-wing politics can mushroom or flower in this country without the support of the state. Whether it is Bal Thackeray or whether it is RSS or Bajrang Dal or anybody, or even the Jamaat-e-Islami or anybody else in Kerala. So I think the access that journalists get in Kashmir or don't get is equally true. And what is the sleight of hand? My final point, sir, is what is the sleight of hand? It's a very common trick in the profession. सोनिया गांधी को अच्छा दिखाना है या बुरा दिखाना है, और प्रतापगढ़ की एक विजिट है. So if I want to say Sonia Gandhi's links go back a decade to Pratapgarh, very true, feels good. I can just as well say Sonia Gandhi has not visited Pratapgarh for 10 years, which is also true. So what do you want to present? Do you want to present without telling any lies here? And you're not even hiding the story. You just made Sonia Gandhi look good or bad, depending on your ideological perspectives, and that has very little to do, if anything at all, with anybody's religion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Javed. I'd like to now invite Ashok Malik to give his perspective. Ashok is a well-known columnist, writes in the Pioneer and Hindustan Times. You've seen him on television, and I'm sure he will give us a refreshing perspective.
Hi. I have two confessions to make. One, I didn't realize we'd be giving a 15-minute opening sort of presentation, which is why I didn't write anything. I've just written down some notes here, which I think the others have as well. Second, I must confess I have never visited Kashmir. I have written on Kashmir more in it's an honest confession, rather than sort of pretend I know all about Kashmir. I thought I'd make that clear. I have written on broader aspects of the Kashmir issue, on strategic issues related to Kashmir, on New Delhi and Kashmir, on Kashmir in India and Pakistan and the rest of the world. In my writings, I have tried to steer clear of trying to comment on the sociology or the internal politics of Kashmir, because frankly it is a complex place. I don't understand it completely, and there's no point sitting here and making absolute statements, whether from the left or the right, on an issue you don't really understand. It's like sitting here and writing on Nagaland, which I don't know enough about. I have 4 points to make. One, go back to beyond Kashmir into this practice of journalism in times of war, insurgency, or a violent environment. Now, this is something which as a journalist has fascinated me, that when you are in a war situation, do you report what your heart tells you? Of course, you want your country to win, or you want your side to win, whatever it is, or do you report something which you see which is factual and which is actually going against what your heart wants to see? There are easy answers, and I'd like to believe truthful always prevail, but I have seen it in practice that it sometimes doesn't prevail. We all read about it in the context of Vietnam, where American journalists faced this predicament. I saw it firsthand in the case of Kargil, where some of my colleagues faced this predicament, and I thought came out shining. We've seen it more recently in the case, rather shamefully, in the case of embedded journalist in Iraq, who basically said what their sources told them to. But I think we must realize that in a war situation, or in an insurgency situation, or in a violent situation, journalists are circumscribed by the fact that they have to depend a lot on what their sources tell them, and they cannot independently verify a lot of what they hear from either side, whether it is from a separatist organization, whether it is from the Indian government, or whether it is from one army or the other army or whatever. To the degree possible, journalists should try and make the fact obvious that they cannot always independently verify what they're getting, rather than just spit it out. But that is something we have to that is a framework we have to work with. Second, in his introduction and in Mr. Naqvi's remarks, you mentioned the circumstances in which non-Kashmiri Muslim journalists, the constricting circumstances in which non-Kashmiri Muslim journalists work in the valley. Now, I appreciate that non-Kashmiri Muslims have it both ways. They are some sections of the Indian state may see them as pro-sympathetic towards the Kashmiri cause, and some Kashmiris may not see them as sufficiently sensitive to an Islamic cause or to a cause of fellow Muslims. I appreciate that, but I don't think it's just non-Kashmiri Muslims who face that predicament. Frankly, every stakeholder, journalistic stakeholder, media stakeholder in that cauldron called Kashmir has his or her own limitations. Kashmiri Muslims have their own limitations. I mean, I've worked in several papers with Kashmiri Muslim journalists who I have complete regard for. They're not dishonest at all. They're honest. They believe in what they're writing. But we're looking at the situation from two different eyes. That doesn't mean he's good and I'm bad, and please don't get me or the other way around. But we're just looking at the situation very differently. Our description of the same narrative will be very different. There's also the case of Hindu Kashmiris. We had very few Hindu Kashmiri voices from the valley, frankly. And years ago I worked with one such journalist, and he was extremely cautious. In fact, I once joked with him, I said, you're more cautious than a Kashmiri Muslim journalist would be. And he said, look, I live here, you don't. It's very easy for you to sit in Delhi and sort of say, use the word terrorist and don't use the word militants because you have some silly editorial position. My children live here and I live here. You don't. So don't lecture me. And frankly, it's a completely understandable point of view. Fourth, if you expand it from beyond Kashmir to this entire discourse on what, whether we like it or not, is the unfinished business of partition. India's engagement with Pakistan, Kashmir, Siachen, call it what you will. Unfortunately, with due respect to Siddharth, we get very few non-North Indian, non-Punjabi, non-Delhi, non-traditional voices. I think mainstream India today, and again, mainstream is a very contested word. I can see a lot of people already getting hassled about it, but I think the mainstream media or mainstream journalism is far more alive today to the fact that a solution to Kashmir is not going to be some great violent prone solution as they may have imagined in the early 90s. I think there's greater sobriety today than there was, times now notwithstanding. There's greater sobriety today than there was about 15 or 20 years ago. There's greater realization, perhaps not sufficient, but certainly greater realization of the fact that the government of India has at several stages let down the sort of hopes in Kashmir. And I think that is reflected far more strongly in the media today than was the situation 10 or 15 years ago, and one can't run away from that reality. Which is why, going back to, since Manoj mentioned the panel of interlocutors, I think the criticism that the panel of interlocutors is not sufficiently robust and should actually have, especially after the goodwill generated by the all-party delegation, which I thought was a great statement. The panel of interlocutors needed political weight. I don't agree with what Arundhati Roy said. I don't agree with her timing either. I don't think she should have said it when she did, especially in Srinagar. But that's a separate issue. I certainly don't believe a sedition charge should be slapped against her, or frankly, a sedition law can be there in the statute book. But I can't imagine a situation where I would agree with it being used against almost anybody, unless there's a complete and a horrific act of violence. But sedition for merely making a statement or writing something is something which is sort of unthinkable, at least for me. But having said that, to ask the interlocutors to go easy on what should be a quiet and sober conversation with various stakeholders in Kashmir and not appear on television every evening, I think is a very valid demand. So I wouldn't, that is not circumscribing the freedom of speech. But they have a task which is, to use Sriram's words, not to give a running commentary on television every day. That's what I need to say. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Najib Mubaki now to